Dorothy Washington's hands trembled as she stared at the eviction notice slapped onto her bookshop door. 23 years she'd poured into Washington's heritage books on Meeting Street. 23 years of serving Charleston's Black community with pride. The notice cited code violations she'd never received warnings about. Through the window, she saw two white police officers laughing beside their cruiser, one holding a thick envelope. Officer Daniels caught her eye and smirked. Her phone buzzed. Mark is coming home today. She'd kept the threats from him, but now Dorothy's fingers traced the wooden counter her late husband, Jerome, had sanded by hand 3 decades ago, back when they'd first dreamed of opening Washington's heritage books. The shop occupied a narrow storefront on Meeting Street in a historically Black neighborhood that had weathered storms, recessions, and the slow erosion of time. Jerome had passed 8 years ago from a heart attack, leaving Dorothy to carry on alone. And she'd done exactly that, turning their bookshop into more than just a place to buy novels and textbooks. It became a gathering spot where elderly residents played chess on Tuesday afternoons, where high school students found books about Frederick Douglass and Maya Angelou, where the smell of old pages mixed with the coffee Dorothy brewed each morning. But 3 months ago, everything began to change. Sergeant Ray Daniels and Officer Kyle Patterson walked through her door on a humid September afternoon, their boots heavy on the hardwood floor. Daniels was a thick-necked white man in his early 40s with cold blue eyes and a crew cut that made him look perpetually angry. Patterson was younger, maybe 30, with reddish hair and freckles that might have made him look boyish if not for the cruel set of his mouth. They claimed they had received complaints about noise and loitering. Dorothy had looked at them in confusion because her shop was one of the quietest places in Charleston. Her customers were mostly retirees who browsed slowly, speaking in hushed library voices, occasionally gathering in the small back room for book club meetings that never exceeded a whisper. She'd explained this politely, professionally, the way she'd learned to speak to white authority figures over 68 years of living in the South. Daniels had smiled without warmth and suggested she reconsider her lease, because the neighborhood is changing. Those words hung in the air like a threat. Patterson had run his finger along a bookshelf, leaving a trail in the dust Dorothy knew wasn't there because she cleaned every morning, and said it would be a shame if something happened to such a nice little business. They returned the following week, and the week after that, each visit bringing new harassment. They wrote parking tickets for customers whose cars were legally parked. They claimed her sidewalk book display violated an ordinance Dorothy had never heard of in 23 years. They questioned elderly Black patrons, asking for identification, treating Sunday afternoon book browsers like suspects in a crime that didn't exist. Dorothy watched her regulars stop coming, their eyes frightened, their steps quickening past her window. She'd reached out to other Black business owners on Meeting Street and discovered she wasn't alone. Maurice at the barber shop 2 doors down had been visited by the same officers. So had Linda, who ran the soul food restaurant on the corner. All of them had received the same message, delivered in variations of the same threatening tone. Sell your property, leave. The neighborhood is changing. Dorothy learned that 2 other shops had already closed, their owners exhausted by the relentless pressure, the mysterious health code violations, the police presence that drove customers away like smoke clearing a room. She tried to ignore it, tried to believe it would pass, but then she'd gone to City Hall to file a formal complaint. The building was all marble and authority, making Dorothy feel small in her floral dress and sensible shoes. She'd waited 40 minutes to speak with someone at the complaints desk, and when her turn finally came, the clerk, a young Black woman named Jasmine, with braids pulled back in a neat bun, had listened to her story with growing concern. When Dorothy mentioned Sergeant Daniels' name, Jasmine's face had changed. She'd glanced around, then leaned forward and lowered her voice. "Ma'am," she said, "I've seen 6 complaints against those officers vanish from the system. Daniel's brother-in-law is Connor Garrison. He owns Garrison Properties. They're buying up everything in your neighborhood. Be careful. They're connected all the way up to the deputy mayor." Dorothy had walked out of City Hall feeling like the ground had shifted beneath her feet, understanding for the first time that this wasn't random harassment or bad luck. This was organized, systematic, a machine designed to crush her and everyone like her. That evening, standing in her shop, surrounded by books that chronicled every struggle her people had ever faced, Dorothy had made a decision. She wouldn't sell. She wouldn't run. Jerome's dream wouldn't die because some corrupt cops wanted to line their pockets with blood money. But 2 days later, she had returned from lunch to find her shop's front window shattered into 1,000 glittering pieces on the sidewalk. Glass covered the floor, sparkling in the afternoon sun like cruel diamonds. Books near the window were damaged, their pages torn by shards. Dorothy called the police, her hands shaking as she dialed, and Sergeant Daniels himself had responded. He'd surveyed the damage with theatrical concern, suggesting it was probably just kids, that crime is arising in transitioning neighborhoods. The way he said transitioning made Dorothy's skin crawl. He'd filed a report with obvious reluctance, and when she'd called her insurance company the next day, they denied her claim. The adjuster, speaking in the bored tone of someone reading from a script, cited insufficient evidence of criminal break-in. Dorothy wanted to scream that her window was in pieces, that hundreds of dollars of merchandise was destroyed, but she'd learned long ago that screaming at people who held power over you only gave them an excuse to hurt you more. The cost of replacing the window emptied Dorothy's modest savings, money she'd been setting aside for roof repairs that couldn't wait much longer. She'd paid the glazier in cash, watching him install the new glass with the sick feeling that it wouldn't last, that this was just the beginning. Her instinct proved correct. Within days, her longtime customers stopped visiting entirely. Miss Patterson, an 80-year-old retired teacher who'd been coming every Thursday for 15 years, called to apologize, her voice thick with shame. She'd been stopped by police 3 times in 2 weeks, questioned about where she was going, made to feel like a criminal for walking down her own street. She couldn't take it anymore. Others called with similar stories or didn't call at all, just disappeared from Dorothy's life like ghosts. The shop grew quiet in a way that had nothing to do with peace. It was the quiet of abandonment, of fear winning. Anonymous letters started arriving, slipped under her door or left on her windshield. The messages were simple and direct. Sell now or lose everything. Some included lowball offers from Garrison Properties, numbers so insultingly small that made Dorothy's blood pressure spike. She'd been monitoring her blood pressure carefully since her doctor warned her about hypertension 2 years ago. But the stress was making it harder to control. One evening, after a particularly bad day where only 2 customers had entered her shop, Dorothy had felt dizzy and short of breath. The room had tilted sideways, and she'd grabbed the counter to steady herself. Her heart hammered against her ribs like it wanted to escape. She'd managed to call 911 before everything went gray around the edges. The ambulance took her to Charleston Medical Center, where doctors ran tests and scolded her about stress management. She'd spent 6 hours in the emergency room, hooked to monitors that beeped reassuringly, surrounded by curtains that smelled of antiseptic and fear. The bill would be enormous, even with Medicare. Her best friend, Reverend Marcus Thompson from Bethel Church, had picked her up and driven her home. His dark face creased with worry. Reverend Thompson was 72, built like a retired linebacker with silver hair and the kind of deep voice that commanded attention from the pulpit. He'd known Dorothy and Jerome since they'd all been young, and he'd watched their dream grow from conversations over sweet tea to the reality of Washington's heritage books. Sitting in his car outside her shop, he told her something that made her stomach drop. He'd seen Daniels and Patterson meeting with Connor Garrison at a downtown restaurant. Another pastor had photographed them through the window, clear as day. Garrison sliding a thick envelope across the table while the cop smiled and nodded. Dorothy had tried calling Marcus again, desperate to hear her son's voice, to tell her everything, but his phone went straight to voicemail. He was still on assignment, somewhere she couldn't know about, doing things she couldn't imagine, serving his country while her mother's world crumbled. She left a message trying to sound normal, saying she loved him and couldn't wait to see him, keeping the terror out of her voice because Marcus had enough to worry about without adding her problems. But late one night, around 2 in the morning, when Charleston was dark and quiet, Dorothy heard sounds outside her shop. She lived in a small apartment above the store, the same space where she and Jerome had raised Marcus, and she'd learned every creak and groan of the old building. These sounds were wrong. Footsteps, whispers, the hiss of spray paint. She crept to the window and peered down through a gap in the curtains, and her heart stopped. Officer Kyle Patterson stood on the sidewalk below, illuminated by the streetlight, spray painting gang symbols on her shop's exterior wall. Red and blue letters sprawled across the brick, the kind of graffiti associated with crime and violence, the kind that would give the city excuse to cite her for blight violations. She grabbed her phone and started recording, hand shaking so badly the video jerked and blurred. She'd pushed open the window and shouted down at him, "What are you doing? Stop that right now!" Patterson looked up, his face caught between surprise and rage. And for a moment, they just stared at each other. Then he smiled, actually smiled, and said loud enough for her to hear, "Better get used to disappointment, Grandma." She held up her phone, showing him she was recording, and his smile vanished.